Man, am I embarrassed. I just did a half an hour of live stream to the World Wide Web. Everyone in the on the internet could have seen it without any sound. I didn't realize the sound wasn't getting on. Now it is. Now I see my audio capture is nice and strong, and I'd like to welcome you if you're still there. I appreciate it that you're there. And I'd like to welcome you if you've come and found this talk later. And right now, it's about 12:30 in the early afternoon on Easter Sunday, the 12th of April, 2020. And I'm Byron Bradley Carrier. I'm here in my home, sheltering in place in Ashland, Oregon, in my office, and I want to present this little homily or sermon talk for you, and I appreciate you're there. For me, I'm alone in my office. I have a camera and a mic, and so I don't know if anybody's watching or if others are tuning in, and I hope they do. But in any case, since I've prepared this, and I'm sorry I was late, if you're still there, again, thank you. I'd like to start it out by giving a toast to Easter. Happy Easter, folks. Happy Easter. This water that I'm going to take a sip of here is billions of years old, billions of years old. And yet over and over and over and over again, it is refreshed, it is renewed. It is what makes life possible. It's what keeps us alive and keeps us going. So here's to water as a good. I'll get to what's good in the course of this talk. And here's to you. Happy Easter. Thanks for coming. If you came to this sermon looking for He is risen indeed, sort of an approach to Easter, then you might want to go look elsewhere, because there's a lot of places that'll give you that message. I have a different message. My message is for non-believers and the rest of us. And it doesn't mean I'm excluding believers. I welcome believers to my thinking and talks and interactions as much as anybody, of course. And I value them as much as any. But I have come to value the non-believers. In my 50 years of ministry, I have often noted how atheists and humanists and people who don't believe the standard lines that they were given in their home or in their church and have struck out in life for something new. I value these people as good and honorable people that are doing the decent thing as best they know how. So this isn't. I don't exclude the non-believers. This is for the dropouts from religions. This is for the never was raised in a particular religion. This is for you too, or this is also for those of you who are in a religion but having all your doubts about whether it makes sense and whether you should be spending your life in that way. People in general try to live a good life, I think. There's lots of examples in our media and the messages we get that, we're all wicked and fallen and people are selfish and mean. And you can find examples of that. And brain science will tell you that your brains are primed to be wary and distrustful and fearful and interactive in a reactionary kind of a way. But we also have brains, this higher brain function, that are compassionate and creative and understanding and planning well. And so I want to praise and protect and promote the whole thing we have here, the whole life we have in this wonderful ecosystem that gives us birth. And I want us to live well together in this ecosystem in ways that make this ecosystem ever better, instead of constantly exploited and exhausted for someone's profit or for silly habits that we've built up that we haven't figured out to change. We can live a lot better than we've been doing, and that's what this sermon is for. So it's just me and you, and I'm glad you're here. I'm sheltering in place. I'm doing my social distancing during this COVID-19 pandemic, which is a serious and tragic surprise that came um, out of nature and has swept around the world and is taking out mostly old people, but sometimes young people when their lungs can't stand the impact of that virus. It's a chaotic time. There's a lot of fear, anxiety, there's anger, there's loss of money, there's loss of identity. People are thrust at home to be together with people that aren't used to being around that often. And now it's 24/7. Domestic abuse is up. There's a lot of people getting invites, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's also a lot of people that are finding each other and enjoying each other and being happy and creative together in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have done if they were just stuck doing the same old, same old. So in some ways, even though it's a chaotic and anxiety-provoking time, it's also a time of opportunity because we get to think about, what is life for? What am I doing during my time? Who am I? And what are we doing as a society? Our civilization, our modern civilization, we're so proud of it and we rely on it, and it's marvelous. It's amazing what we've done, especially lately. But it's also, in some ways, ridiculous. And it's based on people striving to push their lives and their minds into the kind of we have to go along with this as it is in order to have a job, have income, support my family, and all that, when in fact it's built on a consumerist, wasteful model that exhausts our resources and decimates the Eden that we were born into. As all the various species we never knew about die off, and even some of the large ones that we care about are on the brink of exhaustion, and yet at the same time we're starting to care about that. We're starting to realize that if we don't kill off all the eagles and the condors with our DDT, that they can revive, and in fact they are reviving. That if the ozone hole that was caused by our chlorofluorocarbons was opening us up to ultraviolet radiation to fry us, that we're worldwide cooperation by many governments acting together is closing that hole. So there's a lot we can do to rescue and revive our earth, and that's what I'm really wanting to use this Easter to do. That's why I used the water to start out, because the water is kind of like the earth in that it's constantly and reliably spinning on its daily axis in its yearly trip around the sun. And we get our turn in the northern hemisphere to have spring. And that's what we're having right now. We're having the spring when we're reminded that the cycle renews, that new life comes out of what seems like a winter of death. And I want that for us individually and together, externally and internally. The air is cleaner. So people in India have seen the Himalayan mountains for the first time in their lives because their air suddenly is not so full of soot and smog. Los Angeles, the air is clean. Wuhan, China, Beijing. There's so many places where people are hearing the birds because we're sheltering in place and being careful not to interact and transmit perhaps a virus that we wouldn't know we had until it weeks later, or a week or so later, makes us sick. We're careful not to infect each other, and that's good. But we're out walking around. There's families out for a stroll. There's people taking some time for themselves. We've been given back our time. And I think that's so precious and important for us to use well. So it's a good time. Good time to question what is good and how can I find that in my life and how can I help provide that for others. So we're sheltering in place, and we do a lot of things. We perhaps read a book we had put aside. Maybe we'll write a book that we wanted to get done. Maybe we'll clean that drawer and get that thing organized. Maybe we'll plant some flowers and some vegetables out in the yard. Easter. Easter comes from Estra, an old pagan goddess, the goddess of sex and fertility. Now, wait a minute. How could a goddess, right there, female god, of sex and fertility, have morphed into what Christians call Easter? Because in many ways, Christianity is devoid of sex, and devoid of women as goddesses, is devoid of valuing the spring that we're having, because it pines for a scenario where you got to believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead in order to for you to get forgiven for your sins and get into a private heaven. I regret that whole scenario. I think it's misleading to tell people to do all that. Christianity has departed and almost embarrassed about nature as it is, and sex is usually, though not often in Christianity, usually not mentioned, and if it's mentioned, it's with warnings and judgments. Same way with using our heads and being logical and intelligent. We've been taught to not think, but to believe, not to go our way, but to obey someone who's laying down what the dogma is. And I'm of a tradition of people who have rejected that dogma, and for their own reasons, and find their own paths. And I encourage that for all of us. This escapist fantasy that we can somehow live our lives as though it's a staging ground for an afterlife, and that how we treat this world and our marvelous Eden that we're born of, and how we act with each other is largely not the main point. It's like whether you're going to get into heaven, whether you're going to avoid hell. And those are regrettable beliefs. There is no hell. There's hardly any mention of it in the scriptures, by the way. They mention a burning garbage dump at the edge of town. They mention the grave, and then people magnify those images into the sadistic torture chamber that our form of religion has generated in the past and still holds on to in some ways. So I don't mean to offend Christians who have regard and base their lives around being saved, about believing and all that. It provides real solace and direction to a lot of people, and I grant that. There's people who get off the booze or whatever it is. They no longer hit their wife or their husband. There's real benefit to be had in that, and I don't mean to denigrate that, but I do mean to speak to the rest of us who don't resonate to that message so well. I am interested in religion, and that word offends people. I'm interested in God. That word offends people. I'm interested in atheism. That word offends people. People are so touchy about this stuff. But religious leaders in the days of yore used to be also the scientists. They used to be also the philosophers. They used to be also the psychologists. The realm of religion was far wider and more earthy than it has become. The word religion comes from the earlier root words. The etymology of it is religio and religare, meaning basically to bind back to our root and become whole again with the reality. So I like that definition. It doesn't mean you're religious when you believe in God, or if you act even more pious about believing in God. It has to do with becoming whole with who you are and what reality is, to live harmoniously and well within reality. So with that different slant on what it means to be religious, I've spent much of my career. And I've come to believe that the good thing to do in life is to be embodied in the body that you have. and to be grateful for that body, because it is a set of miracles going on all the time, thousands a second, all the time on your behalf, keeping you alive. Things that you did not create, it creates you, and you should be grateful for it, and you should live well and happily and pleasurably in that body. And our ecosystem, which we have in the last few years, and there were other times before when people realized how important soil is, and how important all the little things of the interactiveness nature of nature is to us. So I would rather that we be embodied and we live in an ecosystem in such a way as to synergistically reinvest the good things of life into itself, so that it gives us even more abundance than we ever had before. We Europeans come to this, what they call New World. It seemed like an endless expanse of forest and animals and so forth. But our progress across it has in some ways been magnificent, and in other ways been a real devastation to those soils, to those animals, to those streams. There used to be salmon in all the streams over here on the West Coast. It was thick with them. You get a lot of them every year. And now there's many places where they're just dying out and not there. They're sickened. So we need to return to the goodness that we were built of, and augment that. We have an economy that has somehow generated more wealth than anybody knows how to enjoy, and yet they still want another 20% the next year for some people, despite the fact that all that wealth is being hoarded in offshore banks and in secret places to hide it and protect it, while we have this massive homelessness and people living at the bare raw edge of nothing, no savings, no security. We had social security, but now we have social insecurity, and they want to create even more of that. So we need an economy that is not just good to us, but also good to our ecology at the same time, and reinvest in the good things so that they magnify and they come through more abundantly. So, and I think of religion as dealing well with reality, this side of what we don't know, this side of what's beyond death. What is our lives about? How can we live them in ways that give us satisfaction? And part of that satisfaction is knowing we're doing that in ways that provide that satisfaction and abundance to everyone and doesn't take it from people, instead of a win-lose sort of a philosophy. How to live well, how to live ethically and successfully at the same time. Well, to help remind us about how to do that, I'm going to turn to one of my favorite authors. I value the scriptures and I criticize them, and I value other scriptures. I'll talk about some Eastern ones here in a bit, and I criticize them. And I value my Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I criticize him because there are parts of his writing that are just tedious, and they seem to go on and never say anything other than working to get what he tried to say. But here, in his address to the Harvard Graduating School of Theological Students in 1838, he gave an address that got him, he became shunned. He was notorious for having said these things, and yet they still speak to us. Oh, let me see here. Let me find my right page. I'll take some sentences out of his thing. Here, whilst a man, and by a man he means men and women. I hope we can not have to stop and trip over that every time. Whilst a man seeks good ends, he and she is strong by the whole strength of nature. When we seek good ends, we're strong by the strength of nature. We're not begging for something to come down from above or from someplace else. We are strong with the nature that we're built of. The doors of the temple stand open, and the oracles of truth cease never. But this cannot be received secondhand. This is his main point in this talk he gave. You cannot study books and get anointed by some other authority and really know what you're talking about. You have to live it. You have to be it. You have to incarnate it in your body, in your mind, in order to have it. So that's what he's getting at here. It cannot be received secondhand. The absence of this primary faith is the presence of its degradation. Then falls the church, the state, art, letters, life. The very words it spake and the things it made become false and hurtful. And because the indwelling Supreme Spirit cannot be wholly gotten rid of, the doctrine of it suffers this perversion, that the divine nature is attributed to one or two persons and denied to all the rest, and denied with a fury. Next page, he's talking about Jesus Christ. And Christ was not Jesus' last name. It was a title that was applied to him by Paul and others much later. But he sees in Jesus Christ one man was true to what is true in you and me. In other words, Jesus was true to himself, just like we can be true to ourselves and should be. But the word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, which justifies their belief in Jesus on the basis of those miracles, the word miracles pronounced by Christian churches gives a false impression. It is monster. Shocking word. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. And Emerson was big into the natural reality of the miracle that we're encased in. This ongoing miracle of life that generates us and supports us as we go. And he was also a proponent of tapping into the inner knowledge that we actually have. It has dwelt, the Christian church, historical Christianity is saying here, it dwells with noxious exaggeration about the person of Jesus. Oh, I bet this riled them up quite a bit. But it is always best that gives me to myself. That is best which gives me to myself. That is best which gives you to yourself. He says, always a seer is a sayer. Ah, for all you prophets out there contributing to your forums and writing your letters to your editor, speaking your truth to your families and friends. Your singers of songs, your writers of poems. The seer is a sayer. But the one who speaks as books enable, as synods use, as fashion guides, as interest commands, that one babbles. Let him hush, he says. And then later in this address, and I'll end with this little part here, he talks about something that was true then and I think is true now. There's the causes of a decaying church and of the wasting unbelief. By wasting unbelief, he means, following the rules, the books, the authorities, the traditions, without knowing anything about it. He says, what greater calamity can fall upon a nation than the loss of worship? Then all things go to decay. Genius leaves the temple to haunt the Senate or the marketplace. Literature becomes frivolous. Science is cold. The eye of the youth is not lighted by the hope of other worlds. And age is without honor. Society lives to trifles. And when men die, we do not mention them. He says to them, yourself newborn bards of the Holy Ghost, he's using theological language here, folks, cast behind you all conformity and acquaint us at first hand with the living deity. Let their trampled instincts be genially tempted out in your atmosphere. That's Emerson. We're natural, we're whole. We're involved in ourselves and in with each other and in our society. And we've had a kind of a loss of that, where our very worship has led us astray. Poor Jesus. Let's think about Jesus, the Christ. Now, I admire Jesus. What we know of his story, if he was a person, there's some thought that this is all made up stories, but let's say we do know there was a person, and let's say some of those stories hold some truths. Well, then, what kind of a person was he? He was one I admired. But I don't admire Christianity for what it did to Jesus a long time ago and even still now. There's a big difference. He was decent. He was self-actualized. He was able to be honest and brave, and kind. That's how we're all built to be. And that's what Emerson's message is. We're all built to be this marvelous risen human. Not the fallen creature that we were tricked into believing that we are because of that second creation story in Genesis, the Genesis 2:3 story. The Gospels weren't written to 65 years or later after Jesus, so things change, things magnify, people imagine this and that, stories come in from other traditions. And then whatever Gospels we have are being copied, piece by piece. There were no printing presses, and edited as they go to some extent. Changes pop in. There were various synods that come and decide which books are the approved ones and which ones shall be cast out and declared out of the canon. And essential to the story that we get on Easter especially is that Jesus died and then rose 3 days later, and therefore he's beyond the usual laws of nature and existence, and therefore if we believe in him, we can get beyond the usual laws and get assured of heaven when we believe in Jesus and get forgiven for our sins. We're redeemed, so they say. But let's think about that event a little bit. They say, he is risen indeed. Well, yeah, I think so too. But I think he probably, if he was risen, it was because he didn't get hung on the cross for the agonizing slow death by suffocation that would take sometimes 3 days. And there were a lot of people being crucified by the dominating Roman Empire in those days. He was taken down in 3 hours and put into the cave. And then the story, mysteriously, just like it does with the rest of the Gospels, the women are the mysterious parts there. His mother, Mary, and his lover, I think, Mary Magdalene, and another woman, perhaps Martha, they go to the grave and they get him. They take him away. And then later he shows up to his disciples and shows them his wounds. And they say, oh my God, he's really alive still. And then he's kind of gone. And now there are holy days that are declared as to when he floated up to heaven and all that. But I think it might be more realistic to think that the women were able to revive this poor man after being tortured so badly and bring him back to life. He shows himself and then leaves. There's some marvelous stories about one of them has Jesus and Mary Magdalene going into France, Gaul, what we call France now, and another one where he goes to northern India, and there's a place where Jesus is said to have lived to be an old man, have a family, and has died and put in a grave there. I don't know what's the truth, but I prefer to think of Jesus having survived that hideous, unjust execution and to leave with the person that perhaps should other people would scorn and judge. No, he knew better. And so he left with her. That's what I like to believe. But what's happened is that the story of him being magically and miraculously and against all the laws of nature brought back from the death and then somehow gone up into heaven has led to a big change in the whole thing he tried to do with his life. The earliest symbols for the earliest Christianity were actually the fishes, the symbols of abundance. And then later, the symbol shifted to become the cross, the device on which he was tortured and executed. And today, that cross is at the top of the steeples all across our land, either with the body on it in the Catholic tradition, the body off of it in the Protestant one. But in any case, there's that cross. So we go from an image of abundance, the fishes, to an image of an unjust, cruel device to torture people who are victims. We go from what is natural in a person who manages to not die in that situation to stories that rely on miracles and beyond the workings of life as we know it. We go from the kind of suggestion that people live as kindly and bravely and honorably as Jesus did, to mere belief in forgiveness and escaping hell. You know, it was actually Paul, he was a zealot, and he largely defines what we call Christianity. And his ideas of that were picked up by Augustine, and there's just a whole complex history here, but these are some of the big names. And there was the decision as to which books were allowed and which were cast aside. And there's some marvelous reading for you if you like. Check out the works of Elaine Pagels, who takes a scholarly examination of biblical and archaeological evidence and finds some of the other scriptures that were common in the days of the early Christian movement, Jesus movement. It wasn't called Christian, it was the Jesus movement, and shares them with us. The Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, a number of very interesting books that were cast aside. But we end up inheriting this image of the cross as the central image of what is at the core of our religion. And I kind of bemoan that because it entails both a victim and a victimizer in a story. If a town in Italy wants to put on the Passion Play and they're distributing who plays which parts, somebody's going to play Mary, somebody's going to play the baby, somebody's going to play Jesus, and someone's going to play Pontius Pilate, someone's going to play the soldier that drives the spikes. And I'm afraid that story kind of entails bringing into our consciousness the commonality of unjust torture and of kind, good people. And it's a tragedy, but there we go, because we're all fallen. Why are we fallen? Well, this story says that we were fallen, and therefore we're born with original sin. All this stuff. We're not fallen. That teaching is fallen. We're not fallen. That teaching makes us fall. It trips us up. It says, go ahead, be selfish, be in a win-lose world. You got to compete in order to take what you can get from the other guy, and the guy who does that the best, who's the most greedy and callous and crafty, can get not only all the power but all the glory and get all the privilege. And we have a society that has somehow assumed that's what we do in order to be in a society, when in fact our natures are far more communal. Our natures are far more integrated to our families and friends and society and community than what we've been led to believe. We don't need a win-lose world of scarcity and exhaustion of our Earth's resources so that the last parts can be charged even more for and somebody can get rich off of it. No, we're born good, and we're born into a communal situation, into the connection that we have with mothers and fathers and other family members and people in the village, in our roving tribe, because our whole history is very brief compared to how long we've been humans together. And how we were in that long prehistoric time is often seen as kind of brutal and mean, but maybe not. Maybe it was far more communal and mutually supportive than we tend to think. I'm very big on that Genesis 1 in the Bible. I don't lay the Bible on people and say you have to believe it as God's word, but I recognize that it is believed that way, and that especially Genesis 1 is at the core of what we call the Old Testament, the very foundation of it. And that set of books is basically largely the same set of books that is used by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And yet all three religions, in my estimation, have in their own particular ways violated, as if that's the right word, those goods that were declared good by God when God created it. Elohim, God, creates 6 evolutionary steps. Light is good, water is good, land is good, plants are good, animals are good. Humans, males and females, are good. There's not much instruction in that passage, but I think it's incredibly important that we remember what is defined as good, because the second creation story, the Garden of Eden story, found in Genesis 2:3, is a story about people losing their goodness because they've been tricked into an alternative set of goods and evils where they think they know better. And in fact, they don't. It ends up being a story of alienation from their own bodies and from each other and from their garden, from their God, and into lives of strife and toil and trouble and pain. And it I think, misleads us when we lose the message of that story, which was, remember what was good. Genesis 1. Natural existence is a good thing, my friends. We're born on this thin film of life on this planet in a universe where hardly anywhere else is there anything close to what we have here on this wonderful planet. And it's thin and it's precarious and it's precious. And our religions should be favoring that and finding it and promoting it and rescuing it and making it better than it's ever been, not keep exhausting it to where it's depleted, dead zones in the ocean, coral bleaching white, forest fires raging, fueled by bug blight. You know, we got storms and tornadoes that are twisting with more force, and those who are helped to cause it, they're denying that, of course. So we're in a precarious situation, and our leaders, our teachers, our politicians are giving us a false goods and evils, the ones that are really losing what is originally and ultimately good, and that is who we are, how we're built, what we're built to be. I'm big on that, and if you go to my website, earthlyreligion.com, you'll see various writings around that central theme. I could go on about how we have a society where the CEOs who are overpaid in order to generate profits to other investors who are even more overpaid do so with enforced psychopathic attitude that the only thing they should be doing is generating profits, no matter what it costs to their employees, to the environment, to society in general. And that is really a sick situation. We have a society where we're tormenting the poor people in Iran because why? They have oil. Why? Well, we want to have the only oil supply so we can sell it and make all this money. That's why they're tormenting Venezuela right now. That's why we're aligning with Saudi Arabia, because they have the oil. That's why we're buddying up with Putin and his oil exports. And the oil and the coal that we're burning so rapidly these last few hundred years has created this weather chaos that we are going to keep inheriting on a worse and worse basis, and it could get drastically worse suddenly if we don't suddenly find other ways. And there are other ways. There's lots of other ways. There's all kinds of other ways to live cleanly and healthily together. But currently, we're still investing in profit taking at fossil fuel, spreading them around, running our engines on that, rather than on sunlight and wind and falling water and the natural forces. So anyway, I won't go into that anymore. I'm big on the relationship between religion and technology. So there are other scriptures out there. I mentioned I like some of the Eastern scriptures. And when I did my undergraduate work, I got to study China, and I got to study Eastern religions. And I found a lot of surprisingly wise and satisfying things in those realms. The Confucian and the Taoist ways are quite admirable. They tend to an orderly society. They tend to the relationship. What they call the way of heaven is how you do things on earth. And when you have the way of heaven working well, you're going to have peace, you're going to have prosperity, you're going to have happiness, you're going to have people generating art, music, dancing, having a good time. But when the way of heaven is not being followed properly, they have a concept called the mandate of heaven, where when things start falling apart and there's too many tornadoes and cyclones and droughts and floods and fires and social strife and people dying in addiction and so forth, it's time to depose the ruler. It's the sign that you're supposed to depose the ruler. So I kind of like that they have a way of heaven built into their relationships. The Confucians especially have a whole set of reciprocal, the yin and yang of how we relate between a ruler and the ruled, between the husband and the wife, between the all the aspects of society. That's very good. I also came to value very much the Eastern religions, and they're tending to a very deep and profound exploration of who we are at essence. Who are we in the core of our soul, the core of ourself. And they do so in a way that celebrates natural human reality. Here I have on my desk a statue that I think exemplifies this. Let's see if you can see that. I guess you can see that against me. Here's Krishna and Radha. Maybe turn this light up here. There we go. There they are. Look at them. They're in erotic splendor. They're not hidden. They're bejeweled. They're bejeweled, and they're look at them, lovely couple together. Look at this. Isn't that nice? So imagine a religion that has that as a central image, as opposed to a person on a cross in agony, or a cross there for other agonies. You know, they say the empty cross is because he's risen off of it. Well. It's an unsettling, unpleasant image to have that cross at the center of things. I started out by talking about the water, how it's constantly refreshed and renewed. And I'd like to share with you a similar idea. To me, it's similar. That we say the sun rises and it sets. Where I'm sitting, the sun is over here, and it goes through the sky, and it sets over there. Okay? But that's not so. The sun is central, and we roll from here So it appears to go across our sky, but it's we who are rolling daily. We roll eastward. We roll eastward at the equator, around 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. About maybe, I guess, 700 or so here where I'm sitting still, but moving 700 miles an hour eastward around and around. Now, when I go through the sunset tonight, there'll be a spectacular sunset, no doubt. We have clear skies with a few clouds, so we'll probably see some nice reds and all that. And they change by the moment. Just when you think you define the color, it's going to change. And it's so lovely. It's brief, and it goes away. And then we roll into the night, where we're in the shadow of the earth, and we get to see the larger heavens that we're of in this universe. We only see our own galaxy, unless you know how to see Andromeda. Another galaxy, but otherwise every star we see is only some of the very few of the stars that exist in our own galaxy, and our own galaxy is just one of countless others. But here's the thing: when we roll through the night and we roll back into the dawn, it seems like a new dawn. It seems like this is the next day, but in fact, in truth, we're rolling through a dawn that has never stopped. We get our turn going through it every day. We get our turn rolling through the daylight every day. We get our turn to roll through a sunset every day. But as we continue to turn around and spin with the earth, those phenomena, that dawn, that day, that sunset, that night, are stable in the sense that they don't stop. They continue to exist. They're all the time changing, but they continue to exist. So what's the point? Not only are we renewed every day into the same day, we're renewed every year through the season. Here we are in spring, here we are in Easter, into the same planet, having a reliable course around our sun, with systems that feed and nourish and please us. And the way we live enormously affects how we're going to spin through the day and night and around the year, around the sun for a year. The planet will still spin, but how will we be living on it? And how we live will determine what our future is going to be. And so for me, religion is taking all of this seriously and with celebration and joy and ample pleasure, and to live in such a way as to always reinvest our time and our materials, our energies into the process that does not exhaust, exploit, and ruin it, but exalts it and brings it to ever more beauty, abundance, and perfection, both externally and internally. We could have more salmon in the streams than there ever were if we understand how salmon live and what they need and what makes it work. And we do understand a lot of that. We could have soils that are always richer because we're reinvesting in those soils. We could have an economy that makes everyone well off in some sense, with security and with sustenance, with abundance, with time for each other, with time for enjoyment and art and music and all these things, instead of driving people to strife-ridden lives that are spent exhausting ourselves and our resources in a process that does not continually refeed us in an even more abundant fashion. I'm not saying this well, but I think you might get the idea, and I hope you do. So, planet's still going to spin, but how? And you're going to continue to live past this time, but how? What is it about Easter that might remind you about the inner goodness that you're built of, that keeps you going, that you're built to live well with, and the context that you're in, the family and friends you know, the jobs you have, the ideas you're using, all of this is a good time to think about that and to bring to life the goodness of life. And whether you're a believer or an atheist or a non-believer or a scientist or a barkeep, if you're whatever you are, this is your time, and this is your time to do that well, so that you get satisfaction from it and you feel like you're doing something worthy towards the whole. When we start treating each other and the whole in ways that are grateful and gracious and full of the goods that we're built to be, we're built out of the goods and we're built to be that, then we'll do better and you'll do better. And may you have a wonderful, full, happy life, this wonderful life that you've been given. And may this little talk have helped to remind you about that, so that you can find your ways to that goodness that you're built of. So if you like what I said here, I think there are mechanisms to press a like button somewhere or subscribe button somewhere, and you'll be notified when other talks are coming up. I'll be doing some sort of a vidcast like this on various topics in the days to come. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now. God bless you. Have a happy Easter. All is good. Here you go.